and I work here at the Abigail Adams Institute. Today it is my pleasure to welcome our first ever Abigail Adams Fellow, Dr. Robert Bobby Marsland, for a conversation, our Conversations with Fellows with Affiliates. So, Bobby, welcome to the Abigail Adams Institute space, or HQ.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. And Bobby, we just want to have a conversation about your intellectual interest, but also your biography a little bit. So do you want to tell us a little bit about where you're from and how you came to study physics?
Yes, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and went to a very small Catholic high school that my parents actually helped to get started when I was a freshman. And while I was there, it was we didn't really have many physics courses or upper level science courses. It was still a very small school getting started, but that meant I was able to take physics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a high schooler. And I had very excellent teachers there, got very enthusiastic about physics. I really started seeing physics as a way of understanding the world at a very fundamental level. And so I had that kind of philosophical interest. I really wanted to understand that, and physics seemed like the way to do it. You had these great teachers. So that really sparked my interest in that science. But then I also had some excellent philosophy and theology teachers in high school. That a big part of the school was focused on giving an integral Catholic education. And so right away I had this sort of impulse to try to see how do I fit these two things together? How do I fit the things I'm learning about the soul in my classes at school to these things I'm learning about in my physics class? And that kind of drove, I think, a lot of my intellectual interests since then.
And just curious, Bobby, just even go a little further back, anything before that, before physics, before high school, as a kid, what were your inclinations, or maybe that's a better word than interests, or do you remember, or did you have any sort of defined or consistent?
Yeah, I don't remember having any very particular inclinations as a kid, except I was always interested in, kind of some technical stuff and building things, but also in the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and some of these great novels too.
So Bobby, then you went to Princeton, is that right?
Yes.
When was this?
So that was in 2007. I headed off to this very different world of the East Coast where I didn't know anyone at all. I was the only person from my school to go outside the state, I think. Well, one other guy actually went to New Jersey, but
and why Princeton? Why did you even apply?
So it was mainly because my mom listens to Catholic radio all the time, and she heard Professor Robert George being interviewed, and she's like, "Oh, who's this guy? Is like a professor at Princeton, and he seems really cool, and he's a Catholic and everything. So Bobby, maybe you should think about Princeton." Because I didn't have any idea of the college application process. So we didn't really even have a guidance counselor or anything. So this Princeton looks interesting, and that kind of kicked off that whole process.
Okay. Did you apply elsewhere?
So I also applied to University of Chicago and Notre Dame.
Okay. All right. Big three in some ways.
Yep.
So you chose Princeton, and what did you major in college?
So I ended up majoring in physics, but I actually went back and forth for a while whether I was going to do physics or classics, because I also had some excellent Latin and Greek teachers at Princeton. So I ended up doing what they call a certificate in classics at Princeton, which is effectively a minor, alongside the physics concentration.
And who were some of the intellectual influences in the classics, some professors or books that really shaped you?
Yeah, so I had a really excellent Virgil class where the professor was able to provide lots of context to the work, every day bringing these handouts of other poems that would have been in the air at the time when Virgil was writing, so you could get all of the allusions and the references that he's making. And then also actually a very interesting class on Cicero, where we spent a lot of time in De Officiis and looking at the way he sets up that whole moral framework.
Okay, great. And of course you were taking classes in physics all along. And then do you decide to go to graduate school right away after undergrad, or is there any other options you're considering at the time?
Yeah, so I think I might have played around with some other options, but it was pretty clear that at that point I really wanted to be a physics professor, and so I just applied to some physics graduate schools, got accepted to MIT, but then deferred the acceptance for a year to go get a master's in philosophy of physics at Oxford, which was a very good experience.
And where in Oxford? Where were you? What was your college?
Yeah, so I was at Somerville College.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Like our neighborhood here.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Margaret Thatcher's College.
Okay.
Which,
Oh, okay.
it went co-ed in like the 80s or something, but the other way, because it used to be a women's college.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. So what was that like? The British atmosphere different? Learning atmosphere?
Yeah, and it was amazing just how thick with tradition the whole thing is. That this has been a place of learning for 1,000 years. And so you really feel that and see that even just in the buildings. But then the program was also very high quality. The professors there really were passionate about teaching and were true experts in philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, all the work that had been done in that, especially in the 20th century. And so I got a pretty comprehensive view of what has been the thought in philosophy of science, especially in the analytic tradition. I ended up disagreeing pretty strongly with a lot of the things, but they were very fair for just presenting what are all the options, what are the things that people think. So they were kind of let you come to an opposite conclusion of what the professors were pushing, which was more of the idea I actually had as a high schooler, that physics is the fundamental science, everything depends on physics, that this is where the real truths of the universe are to be found. So the professors there really believed that. And I was already coming not to believe that, and actually that program sort of reinforced my conclusion that actually was not quite the case. Although I still loved physics,
Right.
I thought it was beautiful in its own domain, and decided I still really wanted to do that for graduate school when I came back.
Very interesting. So putting physics in its place, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay, and then graduate school in physics. Where was that? Who did you work with? Who were your mentors, or I guess dissertation advisors?
So then I came to Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2012 to start the PhD in physics at MIT. And there I initially thought I was going to be doing atomic physics, but ended up in the first year switching into biophysics and working with Professor Jeremy England, who had a lot of interest in understanding the conditions for origin of life and a lot of different topics in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. So looking at complex systems of many molecules that are far from thermodynamic equilibrium, which is the situation that living things are in. And so he has a lot of cared about kind of deep questions about how do we understand origin of life, how do we make sense of these things. But he is also a very serious Orthodox Jew and is actually now a rabbi in his local synagogue, in addition to working at GSK Pharmaceuticals. And so I also had lots of great conversations with him about theology and humanities, and he would often bring up just interpretations of passages from Exodus to explain some research direction that we were trying to flesh out. So
yeah, no, I remember
it was an excellent time.
I remember, Bobby, you brought Professor England to speak to Harvard's Kirkland House for one of Abigail Adams' luncheons. So yes, I'm delighted to know that he's still around. So Bob, you graduated, I think at 16 or 17, something like
17,
that?
yeah.
17, yes. And around that time, I guess around 16, I said you were our first appointed fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. You get involved with Abigail Adams. Why? Why does someone who studies physics and has planning to pursue a career in academic physics get involved or interested in Abigail Adams Institute?
Well, so Abigail Adams was a wonderful opportunity to continue the humanistic education that I had really been pursuing pretty seriously at Princeton, because one aspect, which has good and bad aspects of the modern university, is this hyper-specialization. So when I actually moved from undergrad to graduate school, there's not really the same opportunities for pursuing humanistic studies at the same level of seriousness as when I was an undergrad. And so all the seminars and activities that Abigail Adams ran was very helpful in keeping up my reading and writing and thinking and discussing on these deeper questions at the same time as I was pursuing my scientific endeavors.
Yeah. And you, I think it's fair to say, you attended many different kinds of events here at the Abigail Adams over the years. Is there a favorite or most meaningful or one that you've done that you'd like to single out?
Well, I think all of these weekend workshops we had in Providence were a lot of fun, which tended to focus on both political philosophy and metaphysics, and kind of the intersection of those things, which I think is an extremely important area, precisely because I think the ancient Greeks had a great insight that philosophy in this contemplative sense is essential to a just political order. You have to have people who are actually looking at ultimate reality, whether it be, you call it being or mind or the form of the good, that has to be, you have to be looking at that in order to then to think clearly about how society should be organized. I think current events are showing ever more rapidly what happens when you lose sight of that and are just on short-term material interests. So it was great just seeing all these undergrads being gathered together to try to think about the highest things and try to think about everything else in light of those, and being given the conceptual tools and ways of speaking that allow them to really engage with the world in that way.
Bobby, so then to continue the trajectory, as it were, you're appointed a postdoctoral associate, I believe, at the Boston University, and you stayed there for 3 years?
Yes.
So? Is that right? What was that like, and how was that different from graduate school? This is now you're getting deeper and deeper into academic physics. Right?
Yeah, so in some ways, postdoc is similar to graduate school because you're still a full-time researcher, but having gone through all the graduate work, received the PhD, was much more in a position to be kind of directing my own research and really developing a set of interests and ways of approaching things that I really thought was fruitful, that I wanted to pursue. And I was able to find this advisor, Pankaj Mehta at Boston University, who shared a lot of the same kind of instincts and intuitions about what problems are interesting in biophysics. And so that has been an extremely productive 3 years, and it's been a fun group to work with, and we found a lot of very interesting problems on the intersection of statistical physics, biophysics, and machine learning that I think at least some of them will have some lasting value that I think people will be able to build on. So that has been a great experience. Just what is it like actually working at the forefront of a discipline.
And Bobby, most recently during this, perhaps in part during this COVID crisis shutdown, you also had put together some reflections on physics and philosophy, broadly speaking, the place of physics in learning. Would you like to say a little bit more about that? This is an essay, I believe you're working on for publication in a general interest journal or something like that.
Yeah, so there are a number of ideas from all these kind of intellectual interests that were starting in high school and that I was developing through college, and then at Oxford being able to really study philosophy of science. That then I had kind of a new perspective on all of this after having actually worked in physics and the sort of mainstream of things for a few years. And so this summer, as I was finishing the postdoc, I tried to sort of put together some of these ideas of how do we think about the place of physics in the broader structure of knowledge, which is like part of even what the Abigail Adams Institute is trying to do is how do we reintegrate the university. And one important part of that is, how is science actually related to all these other branches of knowledge? And I think that there's some very great work that was actually done by Jacques Maritain on this in the 50s that I was somehow rediscovering. I forget how I ran across it, but I was reading some of Degrees of Knowledge last year and then saw, it seemed like he really got it, so I wanted to try to put that down.
And this essay might eventually be available on the Abigail Adams website, and you can take a look at it. Bobby, so what is, if I can just go just a little bit more, if you don't mind, deeper or substantively into this paper, what would you say is the one correction that the paper makes, I guess, to the general trend of the way we sort of view physics, the way physics views itself in the university?
Yeah, I think that it's essentially a point on just methodological self-awareness that in order to construct a quantitative science, you have to abstract from everything else about the object of study, except for the quantities that you measure, and that's just inherent in the structure of that science. And if you forget about that act of abstraction that took place, then you very easily replace the actual reality you have for this sort of reduced version, this blueprint that you made justifiably, but in order to carry out your science. And so essentially the main thrust of going through the entire essay is what does it look like to remember the whole time that you actually made this deliberate act of abstraction, sort of forgetting about most of the aspects of the thing that you're studying for a very good reason, but that you actually, there's lots that's there that's not captured in your quantities that you deliberately abstracted from that you still have to keep in the back of your mind if you're going to fit everything together correctly.
Thank you. Sounds very interesting. And so, Bobby, can you tell us a little bit? You have very wide-ranging humanistic interests. You read widely within physics, outside of physics as well. What are you reading currently that you'd like to share? A couple of books, maybe.
So one book I'm reading is the Cloud of Unknowing by an anonymous British author in the Middle Ages, which is essentially applying scholastic metaphysics to the life of prayer. And so, what does it look like as a Christian to take seriously the fact that God is absolutely beyond all concepts, that he is the source of all being, and that we are radically dependent on him and can't actually have a concept of him. And so it goes to the very core of all the kind of metaphysics that we're studying in these Abigail Adams seminars and things. But see how does this actually make an impact on your life, which is in a very beautiful way.
The Cloud of Unknowing, written approximately when? Is it known?
I think it's 14th century.
14th century.
But I have to actually double check.
Okay,
that.
yeah, sure.
Could be 13th, but probably 14th.
And what about a book or two that you would recommend for perhaps humanistically inclined young scientists, or doesn't necessarily have to be scientists, but young people seriously, both want to pursue a career, properly defined career, but also are interested in continuing wider humanistic learning?
Yeah, so in terms of books particularly relevant to science, one book I actually mentioned earlier that I think is actually the best thing that I've read on sort of integrating science into the rest of knowledge and trying to think about your work more broadly as a physicist is Jacques Maritain, The Degrees of Knowledge, which is the original French title is Distinguished to Unite. But I guess when they translated it, they thought that English speakers wouldn't get that or something, so they renamed it. But that is a very good book from the 50s by Jacques Maritain. Then also Ed Feser, this philosopher in California who does a lot of work on scholastic metaphysics, published this book last year called Aristotle's Revenge, which goes systematically through all the main areas of 20th century physics from essentially Aristotelian or Thomistic perspective, and trying to see, okay, how do we understand what the science is telling us about how nature is, what is space, what is time, what is motion, and putting these things together. That book is very difficult, very dense. I mean, it's sort of aimed primarily at philosophers of science who are already well acquainted with all these kind of arguments. But it is accessible to someone who's willing to invest the effort, and is very well done. And there are also a couple popular science books that came out recently that are not trying to be too philosophical, but just explain, okay, like what are people doing in science right now? And those are also very interesting for people who are either just curious about science and want to sort of be on top of things, or are interested in getting into the field. So one is by Sabine Hassenfelder, called Lost in Math. So she is a theoretical physicist, I think maybe in the Netherlands or something. But she wrote this book on this sort of crisis that a lot of theoretical physicists, especially string theorists, are feeling, because the experiments that they need to test their theories are becoming more and more difficult. And they're these accelerators you need to build to test these sort of fundamental physics theories, they're kind of getting to the limits of what is actually possible with either sort of the amount of money available, political will, just the size of the Earth, these kinds of things. But on the way, she does an amazing job just summarizing all of current theoretical physics without any equations, but explaining it in an understandable way. Which is an extremely impressive feat. I've never seen anyone really do that before.
Yeah, I could benefit from this.
But she's a very good writer. Explains that very well, and also has lots of fascinating interviews with all the main players in theoretical physics right now. and really getting inside how are they thinking, what is their overall view of the world, what do they think is interesting. And so that is a good thing, just getting the lay of the land with stuff.
Well, we'll certainly link to this one. I mean, others as well
Yeah.
that you've mentioned. Sounds right up our alley, so to speak. So, Bobby, before we started, you said, or we were talking, you have a flight to catch tomorrow.
Yes.
What's that all about? You're leaving Boston, and you might even be leaving physics, kind of.
Yes.
What's
So I'm flying to Rome tomorrow to begin studies at the Interregional Center of Studies for Opus Dei in Rome, the Rome College of the Holy Cross. And this is, I think, well, so ultimately the only way to really make sense of what I'm doing is from a theological or supernatural perspective as responding to a call from God. But there's also a sense of making some effort at understanding from the sort of level of natural reason, from what I was saying earlier about the importance of genuinely like a contemplative metaphysical perspective to the common good. And that this is insight that the ancient Greek philosophers have, that philosophy isn't just about logic chopping, but it is actually a way of life, of trying to organize your life based on contemplation of the ultimate reality, of the ultimate good. And we see how loss of that has led to all kinds of chaos and destruction. In some sense, the most urgent intellectual task right now is actually helping people, especially people who can be leaders in society, to recover that vision and in a very robust way that they can put into action, and with a lot of magnanimity. And so in a sense, what I'm doing is going into full-time preparation, both in terms of intellectual preparation, character formation, to prepare myself to be dedicated pretty much full-time to that work of individually forming people who can be these kinds of leaders that have this genuinely metaphysical perspective illumined by the light of faith, and this access to actually the Word incarnate in Jesus Christ.
So perhaps to end on another methodological note, as it were, how will and maybe you're not quite clear on this yet, although I think you know what to expect methodologically. How will your years ahead look different? The things you're going to be studying from the kind of study you've done thus far.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm going to be finishing the kind of required course of studies for the priesthood by the Vatican, this 2 years of theology and 4 years of theological studies, and then pursuing an ecclesiastical doctorate, probably either in philosophy, on some of these philosophy of science aspects we touched on, the sort of essay I've been working on, or in spiritual theology, looking specifically at these things of what does it look like to really live a life of contemplative prayer and have that affect the way that you're organizing your life, the way you're helping to organize society, and really trying to understand the teachings of St. Josemaria, the founder of Opus Dei, on that point, which are the kind of things where you have some genius that arises in history. It takes a long time to unpack everything that they actually were saying, everything that's entailed by their message. So trying to understand his writings in the light of the whole kind of Western tradition of metaphysical thought is something that people are kind of starting to work on, and that I would really like to contribute to, and think that I'm kind of in a place to do so. So one of those things is probably what I'll be doing in terms of the academic research once I'm over there in Rome.
Terrific. Well, Bobby, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and I certainly hope that you will stay plugged in within limits, of course, over Zoom and Skype and whatnot, and perhaps join us for some of our online events, and also that you will return in person sooner rather than later for visit, perhaps a series, a lecture series, and perhaps even one of these seminars that you mentioned, weekend seminar, intensive seminars that you benefited from and benefited others. It would be nice to welcome you back. So thank you very much for joining us today.